All right, welcome to CIRN's Photogrammetry Basics lecture. So the goal of this lecture is to teach you about the introduction to photogrammetry, equip you with some of the basic concepts and math understanding of how we take pictures and then turn that into quantitative imagery that we can exploit. And so basically the concept is, with a few pieces of information, a little bit of math, we can exploit how a camera lens works to make quantitative measurements of the coast within your camera field of view. Okay, so photogrammetry is a big long word. What does it mean? The word origins here come from photos, meaning light, gramma, that which is drawn or written, and metron, to measure. So we're going to use light and make measurements with it. So photogrammetry is basically the science or art of obtaining reliable measurement by means of photographs. And basically it is the math that allows us to go from taking a picture and measuring everything in pixels, like Meg introduced, and putting it into something that we can make actual real-world measurements in. As Meg mentioned, there are many nearshore processes that have optical signatures, and these optical signatures are what we want to try to exploit to make measurements of what's going on in our coasts. So a few things: as you look out at the ocean, you all probably, without even thinking of it, recognize waves as they're transforming and approaching the coast. The front face of those waves, as they shoal, often looks dark. The back face is a little bit lighter. Then as they start to break, you see white aerated breaking foam. So that's a change in intensity of the pixel that indicates wave breaking. Those waves continue transforming through the surf zone. They leave foam behind. That foam can sometimes be transported by the currents that are occurring at the surface. So we can track that advecting foam to measure complex circulation patterns in the near shore. And then as they get all the way to the shoreline, we can see the waves rush up and down the beach. The white leading edge of the swash contrasts against usually, or hopefully, the darker sand, and we can track the waves as they run up and down the beach. But how do we actually quantify this and turn it into processes that we can measure? So a little bit about the history of ground-based coastal imaging. So aerial photography and sort of traditional photogrammetry was very common starting in the early 1900s. Folks would fly planes along the coast and take downward-looking pictures. If any of you have tried to do research projects that look at long-term shoreline change records, I'm sure there was a component where you were perhaps trying to digitize shorelines or using digitized shorelines from very old aerial photographic maps along the coastline. In the 1980s, Rob Holman and his crew, wave your hand, Rob, say hi to everyone, at Oregon State University, started pointing cameras specifically at the surf zone and realized we can do some cool things with time-averaged photography to map where waves are breaking across the surf zone. And some of the seminal articles or sort of seminal findings and techniques started being published around the 1980s, 1990s, coming out of Rob's group at Oregon State. In the 1990s through to the 2000s, this technique of using coastal imaging cameras to study the surf zone really expanded globally through the development of what was then called the Argus network. So you can think of the Argus network as the predecessor to CIRN. One of the hallmarks of the Argus network was the ability to produce these very automated data products. And so the researchers at that time spent a lot of time and energy focusing on how do we automate all of these algorithms and processing so that if your camera is up taking pictures all the time, you don't have to have a scientist sitting in the background processing the data all the time. It gets processed automatically into information that you can use so the scientists and engineers can do the analysis on the data. And then the last thing to highlight is, I think we're all probably aware, is, in the last 10, 15 years or so, there has been such an explosion of imaging technology. Anything from little GoPros, what we're calling action cameras, to streaming webcams. Drones have basically come into existence in the last 10 or 15 years. So the ability to collect imagery of the coast is no longer limited to a really expensive camera. You can get it from your smartphone, you can get it from a drone, you can get it from wherever. And so we've sort of identified this need to make a lot of the processing tools more adaptable to different imagery input sources. And that was part of the motivation, as Meg mentioned, of forming CIRN. All right, so here's the presentation outline. Basic principles of photogrammetry and camera calibration. We're going to learn a little bit of basic information about cameras. We'll dive into that in a lot more detail in the next lecture with Meg. We're going to learn about things called intrinsics and extrinsics and things like camera models. So that's all the pieces of information that we exploit. We're going to talk through what we use is a very simplified pinhole camera model. That's how we quantitatively relate what we see in an image to the world. We're going to talk through some math principles, some basic geometry, some linear algebra, some matrices, and then we're going to derive the camera equation and projection matrix that is at the heart of the CIRN quantitative coastal imaging toolbox. All right, so some first basic principles about cameras. Cameras are passive sensors. They are not active imaging sensors. So an active sensor is something that actually sends a signal out, like an acoustic gauge sends out sound, radar sends out electromagnetic waves, LiDAR sends out laser beams. Cameras just passively record light coming into the sensor. Cameras provide a non-contact measurement, and thus they are generally not interrupting the process they are measuring. Sometimes if you have a gauge in a very strong current flow, that gauge is actually influencing the flow that it's measuring or how much sand is getting suspended. And then we can use geometric principles, things like collinearity, similar triangles, homogeneous coordinates. I will define all of those soon, and linear algebra. So this concept of a rigid transformation and a projection to allow us to exploit how a camera lens receives that light and understand the relationships between the locations of an object in the world and in an image. And so as you've seen this sort of graphic a few times already this morning, these are the images from the 6 Argus cameras up at the top of the tower. I think we will have time for folks who want to go up the top of the tower at some point in the week and turn those 6 images into a projected or georectified image where you can make spatial measurements. Camera basics, all cameras have a lens. I think we all know that. The focal length of that lens helps determine your field of view, so what you can see with that lens. The sensor size, so that's the little piece that's like actually inside the camera, helps controls the image dimension, the noise level, the number of pixels in your image, things like thinking about image resolution. Then you have a frame rate, how often you are taking pictures. Oftentimes with Argus, we try to take pictures at 2 hertz. Some of these new video streams are by default taking imagery at 30 frames per second. So things to think about. Shutter type, so that's how the camera actually takes a picture. Is it a global shutter, which means it collects light from all those pixels at the exact same time, or is it a rolling shutter where it actually sort of streams through each row of pixels in your image? A lot of webcams, a lot of the cheaper action cameras, things like that use what's called a rolling shutter, and Meg will talk about that a little bit more in the next lecture. And then there are things like the exposure of the image. You can change the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, and all of that affects how good of a picture you take. Is it blown out and really bright white everywhere? Is it too dark? Things like that. So to make spatial measurements, we have to correct for 2 main things. So the first are the camera lens properties. So that's like the shape of the lens, things like that. We call that an intrinsic camera calibration. And then the second thing we need to account for is where the camera is physically located in space and where it is looking. So camera position and orientation. And those pieces of information are called your extrinsic camera calibration. And so if you forget all of this entire rest of the lecture, please try to remember those 2 points. We need to know some information about the camera lens. We need to know where we put the camera, and where it was looking. Without those pieces of information, we will not be able to go from images to maps. So intrinsic calibrations, you might also see them in the literature referred to as interior parameters. As with any field, there are oftentimes a lot of names for the same thing. We use intrinsics as our nomenclature within CIRN. So an intrinsic calibration finds calibration coefficients that are functions of only the camera and lens. So you can find those ahead of time in the lab prior to going out into the field. Anytime you take the lens off of your camera, you have to find and put it back on, you have to redo this calibration. There are different distortion models that exist, which is the model that basically models the shape of the lens, and sometimes it'll find different amounts of coefficients for you. We tried to provide some nice documentation in the toolbox that talks about what we use. The way you do this is you typically take pictures of a checkerboard, something like this. We'll walk you through how to do this later. And then from all these different angled pictures of the checkerboard, we can solve for the relevant parameters. Those relevant parameters we need to know is the focal length. Oftentimes, the manufacturer will tell you the focal length of the lens, but it's important to solve for the actual specific focal length of the lens. The principal point, which is how that lens is actually centered on the camera sensor. That's why every time you take it apart and put it back together, you have to redo this. And then the distortion coefficients, which tell you sort of how warped your image is. I think many of you have probably seen GoPro images where the horizon looks like a big frowny face. That's an example of a highly distorted lens. So in general, the wider field of view, the more distorted your imagery will be, and the more spatial variability in your ground sample distance that you will end up with. And what that means is a pixel in the center will represent a much smaller amount of distance than a pixel at the edge of your image. So sometimes it's advantageous to have a wide field of view, but sometimes it's advantageous to have a more standard sampling interval. So you have to sort of weigh these things. All right, your extrinsic calibration, also called exterior parameters. So this is basically finding the 6 coefficients that describe the location and the viewing angles of your camera once installed. If it's a fixed station, you can generally think of those as permanent, although depending upon what your mount is made up of and your climate, if it gets really hot during the day and really cold at night and things swell a little bit, they might actually change throughout the day. If you're in a UAV, even if you're gimbaled, it's probably not a constant function of time. So for every frame is going to have a different extrinsic calibration associated with it. So the 6 parameters are the XYZ of your camera, the physical location in space, and then the orientation, the heading, roll, and pitch. These are often difficult to measure, and so instead, what we like to do when available is use what we call ground control points. So these are these black and white targets that you see, or can be any type of target that you can reliably see and pick out of an image. And then we go and we survey their precise location, because oftentimes it's easier to measure the location of a fixed target than it is to know exactly where your camera is and where it's pointing. And then once we know those positions of those targets, we can back calculate the position and orientation of the camera. And we found that to be a lot more precise than trying to measure the position and orientation of the camera. So knowing the position and orientation of your camera is critical for making maps with your images. And you need to redo this every time your camera moves, or you can use correction algorithms to match features between images to remove the movement. And we'll go through some of that in the toolbox. We'll highlight a little bit more about how you figure out where to place your ground control points in your field of view. There are worse and better distributions of control points. If you're thinking about it, we're basically trying to solve a system of equations and find a best fit to known locations. So if you have all your ground control points in a line and you're trying to fit a plane to a line, that doesn't work very well, right? It can sort of wiggle and wobble around. So the more that you can spread your ground control points in as many dimensions as possible, the better fit that you will get and the better solution for your extrinsic calibrations you will have. Now, if you have a pier in your field of view, you really luck out because you get to put some sort of point really far out there, which really helps. If you don't, you're probably going to be constrained to something like this setup, and this works pretty well. If you can get something in the far field of view, even better. And we like to say you need at least 4 ground control points, the more is better. And we'll talk through that. Once we have our intrinsics and extrinsics, we can use what's called image projection in combination with known elevations of what we're looking at to project and rectify the image into map space. And we'll go through that a lot more in the image rectification lesson this afternoon. So in order to project an image, it's important to remember you need to have some concept of what the elevations are of what you're looking at. Typically when we're looking out at the water, that actually simplifies things for us because we can say that the water elevation is roughly on average equal to the tide elevation at the time that we took the image. Now, that's a little bit of an oversimplification. We all know waves go up and down. And so depending upon what you are doing and your camera setup, the lower your camera setup, the worse that assumption gets. The higher your camera setup, the better that, or I guess the smaller effects that assumption has on the rest of this process. We do this image projection through a series of matrix multiplication operations, and that's what we're going to focus the rest of the lecture on. So here is the fundamental math that we are going to walk through today and the fundamental process. So this is how you do an image projection. You build something called the P matrix, which is the multiplication of these 3 different matrices over here you see on the bottom left, and we're going to build through each one of these and explain what they do and how you make them and how we get to this point. And the concept here is that we make a grid of points that we think are in our camera field of view, and then we use the camera P matrix to identify the corresponding pixel locations of those gridded points in your image. And so I think this is a main concept that is sometimes initially confusing because I think, when I started this, I thought, oh, we have an image and we're going to start with our pixels and we're going to find the ground position of every pixel. And that's actually not how we do it. We start with our world locations and we find the pixel that corresponds to it. And then we extract the RGB value of that pixel and can fill it into our grid. So this is the detailed steps. I won't go through all of these detailed steps here. We're going to build into this, and hopefully by the end of this lecture, that concept will become a little bit more clear. All right, so we use something called a pinhole camera model, and I stole this image. There's thousands of versions of this image on the web for you to go look at and explore. I stole this one actually from MATLAB. And so the concept of a pinhole camera model is that we use a very simple camera and we assume it doesn't really have a lens and it has one single small aperture, which means that all the light that camera is receiving, rays that are reflecting off of all your objects in the field of view, come back through one single little pinhole. Those rays cross and the image gets projected upside down on the sensor or film behind that lens. And so instead of solving everything upside down and dealing with that, we use this concept or we use geometric principles that says, hey, this image that's projected back here on the sensor frame is actually the reverse of the right side up image in front of the camera. And so this process is oftentimes, you'll see it called image resectioning. And this is basically the process of figuring out which incoming light ray is associated with which image pixel. And then the focal length here, which is the distance between the aperture where all the light rays come in and your sensor, is what controls proper scale of your image. Okay, so this pinhole camera model assumes a concept that we call collinearity. And all that means is that an object point X in the world, so the top of this tree, the camera projection center, which is the center of that little pinhole lens, and then the projected point, which is little x, either upside down or in front on the virtual image, are all collinear, which just means they lie on the same straight line. And then these straight lines, you can think of this as the light rays reflecting from objects in the field of view that are traveling through the pinhole to the camera sensor. And this text down here in the bottom is just talking about the difference between what you actually get on the sensor behind the camera versus this virtual image plane in front of the camera. Okay, so in order to build that matrix and do all this math, we have to get a handle on different coordinate systems, because it's basically a series of coordinate system transformations to go from those gridded points in the real world to pixels in the camera. And so we have something called the world coordinate system, which we're going to try to show in yellow. Hopefully we've gotten our colors right throughout this whole presentation. And your world coordinate system, that's something like UTM or state plane or your local coordinates. And so typically X and Y are the horizontal axes and Z is your elevation axes. And these are all right-hand rule coordinate systems. We then have something called the camera coordinate system, which we're showing in red. And the camera coordinate system origin is at the center of that camera. And then typically we define the axes of our camera coordinate system with Z looking down the camera optics, and then X and Y basically being in line with the center plane. Then we have our image coordinate system, which is the X and Y coordinate system of the little virtual image, which is where we like to work, in front of the camera versus the upside down one behind the camera. And then in green, we have our pixel coordinate system, which is actually slightly reversed from our image coordinate system. And we'll get into that in a little bit later. So this complex setup is what you will experience in the real world, and we will build through how to deal with that. But we're going to start with a super simplified scenario to try to understand these concepts. And in this simplified scenario, we're going to assume that our world and camera are already aligned and centered in the same place. And then we're also going to assume that our image and pixel coordinate systems are aligned, so we don't have to deal with that flip between UV and XY. So a little bit simpler scenario to walk through and understand the relationships, and then we'll add the complexities back in. All right, so this is taking that tree simple camera model and turning it more into a mathematical model. The tree and the camera are removed, but you can think of A as the point on the top of the tree, C as like the little center pinhole of the camera, and then this black square is our virtual plane image in front of us. And so basically in this plot, we're showing you the principles of collinearity, so that big A, little a, and the camera center all lie on the same line. And then similar triangles in that there are very simple geometric relationships between all of these distances. And then it's important to remember that the location of the image plane in the camera coordinate system is controlled by the focal length of your lens. And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit. So that distance is your focal length. And then we've got our coordinates in the camera coordinate system for big point A, and then you've got coordinates little x, y in blue of the corresponding point along the same light ray in the image coordinate system. And so if we basically try to extract the black lines from this image on the left and plot them over here on the right, we can write down the relationship between the image coordinate system, the blue numbers, and the camera coordinate system, the red numbers. And we can do that in both the X and the Y dimension of the camera coordinate system. So this first plot is showing you your Y dimension relationships, and the second plot is showing you your X dimension relationships. So that's locating a point in the camera coordinate system in the image coordinate system. And one of the things that's important here to get as far as a concept is that in our camera coordinate system, points have 3 coordinates. There's an X coordinate, a Y coordinate, and a Z coordinate. When we go into image space, we now only have an X and Y coordinate. And that Z coordinate is directly related to the focal length, so the distance that your image is from your little center pinhole model. And so we can take these relationships that we developed from the prior slides for relating our image coordinates, X and Y, to our camera coordinates, X, Y, and Z, and we can write those in matrix form. And so that's the very simplified version of mapping a camera coordinate into an image coordinate. But as I just mentioned, our image coordinates is a 2x1 matrix, and our camera coordinates is a 3x1 matrix. And so we're trying to do this all in image multiplication steps. And so it is hard to go. You can't go from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions in one step. And so we have to do something called homogenize the coordinate, or homogenization. And this is a very fancy word for a somewhat simple and straightforward concept where we can divide your values in your 3x1 vector by the third coordinate such that you end up with X, Y, and 1 for your 2-dimensional vector. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on this slide. So you can think of this homogeneous coordinate of how far your image plane, or correcting for how far your image plane should be from the camera. And so this allows us, as it says, to transform a Cartesian 2D point XY to simply add a unit value as an extra coordinate. And this third coordinate is really controlling the scale of your image. So when your image is close to the camera, all your XY values, your XY coordinates would be smaller. And if your image is far from the camera, that image gets blown up. And so those XY values become larger. Now, we want to actually do math with the measurements being the correct size. And so we want that virtual image to be at the right spot so that our scale is right. And the right spot is at the focal length from the camera. And so if you don't homogenize your coordinates at the end such that your pixels are all U, V, and 1, your image will not be the right scale and your measurements will therefore not be correct. And I think this is probably like a really tricky part of this lecture, and the best way to, I think, understand it is to dive into the details of the relationships of these plots here that we don't have time to cover in a ton of detail, but go back and try to look through the sequence of those slides. And hopefully we've included enough text that it will be clear. But I think this is the part that oftentimes trips a lot of people up in this concept. But you know, I like to think of it as all we're doing at the end here to go from our camera coordinates to our image coordinates, we need to drop a dimension. And in order to drop a dimension, that Z of the camera coordinate, the distance from the camera, we need to have that image at the right distance from the camera. And you do that by dividing by, at the end, the third value of the U and V of your vector that you get out. So it's UV1. One of the great parts about working in homogeneous coordinates is that we can then write this whole process as a series of matrix multiplications, which allows us to do rotation and translation calculations as one matrix multiplication step, which makes the math a little bit easier. So you can build out all these pieces of these matrices, multiply them together, and then just have to do one math step to go from your world coordinates into your UV coordinates. And this is an example of how we can write a rotation and translation in both a vector math equation, like you might see here, or in matrix form. So if we put all of these pieces together to build our very simplified, what we call K matrix, and this is again assuming that our camera and image coordinate systems are already aligned, we can walk through these substitutions of these different relationships and end up with the matrix multiplication step down here, where we go from camera coordinates, which if you remember in our simplified setup is the same as your world coordinates, so that could be the coordinates of your grid. We then multiply by what's called a basic camera matrix. Then we homogenize, and you get your image coordinates here. All right, so that's a super simple setup, and your world and camera are never actually aligned, and your image and pixel are not usually aligned. So we're going to add a few more parts to make this practical, and that equation is going to get a lot bigger. Okay, so first, let's account for the fact that our image and pixel coordinates were aligned and centered on the principal point in our original assumptions, but that isn't often the case in the real world. And so Brittany made these nice diagrams to try to illustrate this for you. So our camera system is in red. Our image coordinate system is in blue. So you can see X and Y are aligned. That makes that homogenization and the transition from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions easier. But then this accounts for the difference between your virtual image in front of the camera and the actual image behind the camera. So in addition, our prior slides assumed that the lens was absolutely centered on the sensor and that all of your sensor pixels were perfectly square, which they rarely are. And so these are additional parameters that you solve for in your intrinsics. The principal point is basically telling you how your lens is aligned on the center of your sensor. And so we just do a simple subtraction to move the center of the image to align with the center of the pixel. Thank you, Brittany. And that's what U0 and V0 coordinates become right here. Then in addition, we have to account for the difference in the alignment of the image and pixel coordinate system. So that's what the minuses are on the focal length parameters, your fx and fy. And then if you want to, you can add this little skewness value here, which accounts for the actual shape of your pixels. And so the lens distortion lesson, which we'll get to later, will teach you how to solve for these parameters to put directly into your matrix by taking pictures of that checkerboard. All right, so we've built our final K matrix, which is what you use to convert your camera coordinates to image coordinates and then to undistorted pixel coordinates. And this is just sort of a nice summary slide for you to have as reference to remember what each of the components of the matrix are. This is also defined in the comments of the CIRN Quantitative Coastal Imaging Toolbox. And there's a note here, this 1/z C is basically what homogenizes the final answer to put the image at the right scale from the camera. And we added this part, so there's going to be a little star, this little purple star, which is going to represent that homogenization step that you have to do once you do all of the matrix multiplication to get the correct UV pixel coordinates. And we've just put that there to remind you to do that step. The toolbox does it for you, but in the notations of the lessons, we wanted to remind you that there was this final homogenization step after you do the matrix multiplication. All right, So now we're going to build out the R and T matrices, so the rotation and translation matrices, which are going to allow us to solve the more practical problem of when our camera and our world coordinate system are not aligned. And so recall your world coordinate system is something that you measure points in, like with the GPS, your UTM. It could be a local coordinate system, typically X and Y, to find the plane horizontal values, and Z is your vertical elevations. And then in your camera coordinate system, typically that's rotated such that Z is looking down camera and your X and Y vectors are aligned with the image plane that you are taking a picture of. So basically your R and T matrices are gonna first do a translation to translate the center of your world coordinate system to be aligned with the center of the camera coordinate system. Then we're gonna do a rotation to align those axes together such that our world coordinate axes are now aligned with our camera coordinate axes. The inputs into these matrices are going to be your exterior or your extrinsic calibration coefficients, your X, Y, Z, and orientation of the camera. All right, so let's build this out. So first we need to transform our world coordinate system to align with the camera coordinate system. We do this through a rigid transformation, and the first step is the translation, is aligning the origin of those two coordinate systems together so that we can rotate in a nice happy place. And so we do that by we just subtract your camera X, Y, and Z in the, oh, that should be a ZW right there. That's my fault. So that is your camera, the location of your camera in world coordinates. All right, so we do the subtraction to do the translation. And so you should watch these little coordinate systems over here line up with each other. So first we translate, and then we need to rotate. And so in order to rotate, we have to use angle definitions. The CIRN toolboxes use the conventions of azimuth, tilt, and swing. So azimuth is going to be the rotation about the Z-axis. You can think of that as the heading of the camera where it's pointing. Your tilt is going to be your rotation about the Y-axis. So you can think of that as your roll. No, your pitch. Sorry, friends. So tilt is going to be your pitch. So how far down or up you are pointing. And then your swing is going to be your roll. So how far left or right, whether that horizon is level. And there's a nice detailed discussion about this, both in the CIRN user manual, which is either available as a PDF or is in the wiki on the GitHub. And so this just builds out, this is the actual form of the rotation matrix that we use in the toolbox. You do not need to remember this or write this down. The toolbox does this for you, but if you want it for your records to understand what it's doing, there is the full written out rotation. All right, so review of steps. The first thing we do is we translate the world reference frame to a camera-centric world coordinate system. So we move the origin to the camera location, and that's what this T matrix does as you apply it to your gridded XYZ points. Then we rotate the camera-centric world coordinates into a camera orientation. So this is aligning our world and camera reference system to get camera coordinates. So basically you start with your grid, you first do the translation, then you do the rotation. And now we have camera coordinates. So now we can employ that K matrix we built that goes from camera coordinates into image coordinates. So we can add our K matrix back in here. So we're building out this full projection matrix. So this is the final version of your projection matrix. You start with a vector of your gridded XYZ points. You then translate them through the first matrix multiplication. You then rotate them. Then you do the conversion from camera to image coordinates, and you homogenize to get your distorted pixel locations at the right scale. If you wanted to write that out as a system of equations, that's what it would look like. I don't suggest doing it that way, but that is the full matrix math multiplication written out. And then, let's see. Yep, and then this is the final slide. The last piece of the puzzle that we have to account for is we've gone to what we call undistorted pixel coordinates, which don't account for any warping of the lens. And so the final step is to go from undistorted UV pixel coordinates into distorted UV pixel coordinates. And then as a reminder, yellow points on the right are your world coordinates of the object you care about or the grid that you want to make your image on. The purple is your camera center in those world coordinates. The dark orange is your rotation matrix with your 9 elements, which are derived from the 3 orientation parameters of the camera. The blue is your K matrix, which is a combination of those intrinsic parameters, your focal length and your principal point. And then the green are your undistorted pixel coordinates of the object. And the star is to remind you to homogenize so that you end up with 1 there. Oh, sorry, the next slide had it all written out. So this tells you where you can get all those pieces of information. So your camera position comes from making either a measurement of the location of the camera or more precisely by solving from the GCPs in the field of view. Your camera orientation also comes from solving from those GCPs in the field of view. And your intrinsics comes from the lens calibration.
Okay.
Yes.
The homogenization factor, is that something that is a function of like where the pixel is? I'm sure it's a single value.
It's so the homogenization is basically when you do this matrix multiplication out, you will get a 3x1 vector, and the last entry will not be 1. And so so you just scale it to be 1.
It's not one value for the entire image, though. Like each pixel.
Every pixel.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Right, and so this is talking about how we then go from an undistorted image, which is when you do the first part of this projection matrix, a camera pinhole model assumes no distortion, and so it assumes that your image looks something like this. It assumes that all those light rays did not bend at all, right? They came through in nice straight lines. But the lens has some curvature to it, and so it actually bends those light rays a little bit. And that's what this undistorted to distorted calculation does, is accounts for the bending of the light rays through a lens, which our simple camera model ignored. And we'll talk a lot more about how you do this in the lens distortion lesson a little bit later on. All right, so once you have your pixel locations in distorted pixel coordinates, it's then a very simple lookup table where you go and you say, what are my camera or what are my image intensities, my RGBs at those locations, and you basically fill them in to your grid that you started with to produce the image on the left. So basically all this is doing is creating a lookup table so that you know if you have a coordinate in the real world, what pixel to take your RGB intensities out of from your image. So it's a really fancy lookup table. All right, so here are the steps that we started with that we then walked through and built through. So again, we start by making a grid in world coordinates. We then use the camera projection matrix to identify the corresponding undistorted image coordinates UV for the gridded points. And P is that K times R times T. And the steps of what P does is it converts world coordinates to camera coordinates using R and T and accounting for your extrinsics. It then converts and homogenizes, which you can just think of scales, camera coordinates to undistorted pixel coordinates, UV, using K. Once you have your undistorted pixel coordinates, UV, you have to convert them to distorted pixel coordinates, UVD, again using your intrinsic information. And then you extract the image intensities, RGB, from those UVD coordinates. You then assign them to your XYZ in world coordinates, and you plot that grid as an image. And that, in a nutshell, is how you go from an image collected in oblique space to a mapped image that you can do science with. And so you'll notice the importance again here of those intrinsic and extrinsic calibrations, which is why I said if you forget all of the ugly or beautiful math, depending upon how your brain works in the middle, please remember to do your intrinsic and extrinsic calibration, and you'll be able to do this using the toolbox. So, one last final summary. To go from world coordinates to distorted image step, you run through these steps in the toolbox. There's this handy dandy little function right here, XYZ, to distorted UV, that actually does all of this for you in one step. You give it your intrinsics in the right format, your extrinsics in the right format, and your XYZ points that you want to convert to UV. It also provides you a flag that identifies points that are outside of your image plane. So sometimes you make a grid and some of those points are not actually going to be in your image. And so this will flag that for you. Now, we started this by saying we don't typically go from image to world. You can actually go from image to world, but it's a lot harder. It's a somewhat underdetermined problem, and so you have to give it some additional information. And so we'll get into this in a little bit more in the image rectification lesson, but there is a function that allows you to go the opposite direction, but you have to give it some known pieces of information to make that work. All right, so we did it. We got to the end. Photogrammetry allows us to make quantitative measurements from imagery. We can exploit our knowledge of where the camera is and where it's pointing, the properties of the camera and the lens, geometric principles, and our understanding of how cameras work using a simple pinhole camera model. We do this using projective mapping and the camera equation by calculating the camera projection matrix P. And the function image rectifier solves for this complete process and equation within the toolbox.